Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Pro Life, Pro Liberty Live. By request from a viewer, we will be doing a responding to pro choice arguments segment here, and then I will go into some interesting things that could be happening this year, some GameStop stuff, all of that. So, what I'm going to do, because these are kind of two very different segments to today's live stream, I'm going to put timestamps after the live stream is done. I'm going to go in and put timestamps from where I switch from talking about abortion and pro-choice arguments, and I switch over to the news and other things. I'll put the timestamps in there in the description, so if you're watching this later and you only want to watch one part or the other, you can skip around. But I will do that after the stream. Obviously, I can't do that now because I don't know how long I'm going to spend talking about either of these things. But in the description, there is a link to the video that I am going to be responding to. It is a video that was, again, sent to me by a viewer who wanted me to respond to this pro-choice argument. And it's actually a video the video is a debate between David Boonin, who is the pro-choice person who I'm going to be responding to, and Trent Horn. Now, Trent Horn, you may know him if you do any kind of pro-life apologetics, or if you're Catholic, because he is very prominent with Catholic Answers. He does a lot of stuff with them. So you've probably heard his name before if you're in either of those categories or both. Which there might be some overlap there just a little bit. But so Trent Horn is awesome. I'm not Catholic, but I do think he is. He's a very intelligent person. He is a very logical, rational person. He's very good with philosophy, very good with apologetics. So I'm not going to try and claim that I can give a better answer than he did, or in any way try to I'm not trying to one up him here. I was just, it's like I was asked to look at this argument. So I will say that he does a great job in his response. There are some things that I would say differently, but that's not necessarily a he's wrong. It's just I have different perspective and whatever. And also, there's a difference when you are just debating on a stage with another philosopher in a formal debate. You get 5 minutes for this, 2 minutes for that, versus having a dialogue with somebody either like in person, face to face, or over the internet, or whatever that may look like. So I want to kind of address the argument that David Boonin is making, but do it in a more of a way where that might be useful to you if you're just talking with your pro-choice friends. So David Boonin's primary argument, it's like a 2-hour debate. So if you're like, oh man, it's too much to watch, or too much to listen to, it's a 2-hour debate. They touch on a lot of different topics, but David Boonin's primary argument is he uses this legal case, regarding a bone marrow transplant. And so the broad overview of the case is something to the effect of, you know, person A needs a bone marrow transplant. Person B is his cousin. So they're cousins. Person A and person B are cousins. Person A needs a transplant. Person B may be a match, and does kind of initial testing and says, "Oh yeah, we might be a match." And then there's like additional testing required to confirm that they're a match, and then the whole procedure of bone marrow transplant. And person B changes his mind and says, "I am no longer going to go through this process." And person A, who needed the bone marrow transplant to live, sued person B, who is his cousin, and said that person B had an obligation to continue the testing, and if he was a match, to donate the bone marrow. Now, obviously, the court said no. The court said no, he did not have an obligation to donate his bone marrow, even though it meant that likely person A would die, because likely there would not be another match. It's one of those things where it's very very rare type and all that stuff. And so David Boonin argues from that you cannot force a woman to use her body to sustain the life of a fetus, in the same way. And so what I do appreciate about David Boonin's argument is that he does begin with assuming personhood. So we're not arguing personhood in this case. However, I tend to find, just in general, that when I talk to a pro choice person who is willing to assume, who says, well, I will assume for the sake of argument that this born child is a person, I appreciate that, but usually it's just, I don't believe it. because when you assume something like that for the sake of argument, that's a pretty fundamental foundational point. And usually what I find when I have those conversations with people is they're not really assuming it. Because if you break down and you chip down at their argument, you'll find that they really don't believe that it is a person. And you'll get to the point where they're like, well, it's not the same as this or that because it's just a fetus. And then you're like, okay, well, that so a lot of times you end up back on personhood. But let's go with, okay, David Boonin believes that the fetus is a person, a human being, a person with rights, with equal rights, and still does not, the mother still has the right to an abortion, because she should not be forced by the government to use her body to sustain the fetus. Now, I have a couple of issues with the analogy. I have a big issue with the bone marrow / organ donation analogy. And the big issue is that there is a difference. And they always try to claim that there's not really that big of a difference or it doesn't really matter. There is a difference between failing to save someone, okay, between failing to save someone and taking action to cause them harm. Those are two different things. Because here's the thing. My bone marrow could be a match for somebody out there. I don't know. I don't know if my bone marrow is. I haven't gotten tested, right? So they always have those commercials, be the match, get tested. And maybe I go get tested and maybe I'm a match for somebody and maybe I donate my bone marrow. That is a heroic thing. That is me taking an action to help somebody else, possibly saving somebody's life, which is a noble and wonderful thing to do, but nobody should ever force me to do that, right? I do not have, and I'm not even going to get into responsibility arguments because the responsibility objection is something that Trent Horn gets into. I think you can go that way. I think you have to be careful how you go that way. And one of the things I didn't love about the debate is they didn't really address the issue of rape. They touched on it, kind of went around it, like kind of danced around it a little bit. But Trent Horn was basically, oh, well, like 99%. And I'm like, okay, yes, 99% of abortions are not in case of rape. However, I think in order to really establish the right to life and the personhood of the preborn child, I think you do have to take those into account. I think it needs to be a principle that does not change with the circumstance of conception. I think that's important to the pro-life ethics. So I don't like to say, oh, well, that's only 1%, because I think that does undermine our main point, because regardless, it is a human being with dignity, value, and rights. So where I want to go back to is this idea of acting to harm someone versus inaction, right? I do not believe that somebody should be compelled to action. So, for instance, me choosing to donate, I think that is an action. I should not be compelled to take that action. However, I think according to the non-aggression principle, I think that if we have any kind of government, if we have any rule of law, if we have any kind of law enforcement, a function of that should be preventing somebody from taking action to harm another. So when we talk about the non-aggression principle, in libertarianism, in minarchism, anarchism, any of the anarcho-capitalism, any of those spheres, and we're talking about the non-aggression principle, what we're talking about is the idea that you cannot aggress against someone else. We would not say that a lack of action or passive, just me not doing anything, we would not say that that is aggression, right? But if I choose to go out and harm somebody, that is aggression. And so my argument would be that abortion is an act of aggression against a human being, against a person, and it violates non-aggression principle. Failing to donate bone marrow, failing to donate an organ is not an act of aggression. It is inaction. It cannot be aggression by the fact that it is inaction. It is passive. It is a lack of action. Now, in Christianity, in Christian moral ethics, we can talk about sins of omission, right? If you walk past the person, the Good Samaritan story, you walk past the person laying on the road, in Christianity, we would say that is sinful to walk past that person. However, in a legal framework, in the kind of framework that we have in our legal society today, I do not think that is the same thing. I think those are different things that we need to talk about. So really, it really comes down to that. I really think there is a difference between taking action to harm somebody and failing to take action to save someone. If the pregnant mother does nothing, if she finds out she's pregnant and all she does is care for her own health, she eats healthy, she does appropriate safe exercise, under supervision of a doctor, whatever. And even then, honestly, if you're exercising in a safe way that's safe for you and healthy for you, you're probably fine. I know pregnant mothers who have done, like, I know mothers who, while pregnant, have done crazy, I know one family friend who, when she was pregnant with her youngest, she could keep up with my dad in the gym, like in fitness classes, and my dad's like a fitness buff a little bit. And so, but she could keep up with them because so there, I think, my point is that if you are taking care of yourself and you are healthy and you are doing all those things, you should be fine for the most part. Now, there are pregnancy complications, just like there are health complications. There are health problems that arise for people that they have to deal with. But for the most part, in general, if this woman who is pregnant simply lives her life and takes care of her own health and takes care of her own body, she is also taking care of her baby, and her baby will grow and go to term and she will eventually deliver. Now, I'm obviously, pregnancy has a lot of difficulties and challenges and discomfort and all those things that go with it, but she does not have to take a voluntary conscious action every day in order to sustain that pregnancy. She would have to take a voluntary conscious action to end that pregnancy. But even more so, I'm going to go a little bit beyond that, because in abortion, when we're talking about abortion as an act of aggression, I would argue that only the person who is performing the abortion is committing that act of aggression. So the woman who walks into Planned Parenthood, I do not believe she's committing an act of aggression in that sense. You could argue because she's paying somebody to do it, whatever. There's a lot that we can go into on the culpability of the woman, and I think that is a discussion we can have, but I do not want that to be our focus. I want to talk about the culpability of the person who commits the abortion. Now, if she commits an abortion herself, if she does a self at home whatever abortion, then she is committing that act of aggression. But if she goes to Planned Parenthood is committing that act of aggression. The abortionist is committing the act of aggression in that situation. So when we talk about, oh, she has to use her body to sustain, when I talk about abortion and abortion being illegal, I'm saying it should be illegal for somebody to go in with an instrument, with a drug, with whatever, and purposefully, intentionally end the life of another human being. That's what I'm saying should be illegal. If you don't do that, if you don't intentionally destroy the life of that human being, and there are otherwise no pregnancy complications, that baby will be born healthy, generally speaking. Now, there are pregnancy complications where there are difficult situations and difficult decisions that have to be made. But again, I think the goal should always be to not end life when you don't have to, right? The goal should always be to preserve life. I think that is a goal that we should have as a society, that preserving life should be a good thing. And now I think we should also preserve freedom, right? I'm pro-life and pro-liberty. I think we should preserve life and preserve freedom. We can't get so focused on preserving life that we lose freedom, because then we will also lose the ability to preserve life. But that's a whole different tangent. But if our general mindset is we want to preserve life, and there is a pregnancy complication, in the vast majority of cases, preserving life can mean preserving both lives, preserving both child and mother. In the vast majority of cases, there are very, very few exceptions to this. There are a lot of times where doctors will recommend abortion just because it's easier and they don't want to deal with the complications. They don't want to deal with a complicated patient, right? Doctors don't want you to have like complicated health conditions. They want you to have real simple things where they can say, here, take this pill and go away. They don't want to actually monitor you and diagnose things. They don't want to run tests and stuff. They just want to you show up, they say, oh yeah, I'm feeling like this. Okay, here, take this pill, bye. That's what they want to do. So a lot of doctors will, sadly, when there is a complication, just tell the mother she has to abort. And so you'll talk to mothers who will say, the doctor told me I had to abort to save my own life, or to something like that, something to that effect. And then if they go get a second opinion from a doctor who actually has like principles, that doctor will say, no, we can do this and this and this. You don't have to have an abortion. What? Amazing. Or even if she just goes to a doctor and says, you know what, I want to keep this baby. Doctors say, oh, well, in that case, we can do this, this, and this. And it's actually interesting because Dr. Anthony Levatino talks about this in the interviews that he does when he was both an abortionist and an OBGYN. So he was performing abortions and simultaneously, like on the other side of his practice, like, he's got a patient in one room who's got an abortion scheduled, and he's got a patient in another room who is about to have a baby. And the patient in one room, he's telling her like, "Oh, no big deal. It's just a clump of cells. They can't feel anything. It's nothing." And then he goes into the other room and he's saying, "Oh, like we're going to do everything we can to save your baby." And and he was doing those simultaneously because the doctor can flip the switch like that. And a lot of people don't realize that. So when we're talking about pregnancy complications, I think people don't realize how far modern medicine has progressed such that we don't have these situations where you have to choose between the baby and the mother. Like that doesn't really happen. That's not really a thing. There are very, very few cases. Cancer is one of the very few that I know of. But even then, they're getting really good at treating cancer without harming the baby. And actually aggressive in some cases. There have been some cases where they said, okay, we got to do chemo, we got to do radiation, we got to do all this stuff. And they did it, and the baby survived and was okay. So I'm just saying, like, I'm not saying that, that's always going to be the case, but I'm saying that if doctors are willing to try to save both, I think we can in most cases. So hopefully that made sense as far as that argument. I really do think comes back to the difference between I am choosing to harm somebody, I'm choosing to end someone's life versus I am choosing not to do something that would save them. Right? I don't even think you have to get into responsibility. I think it's action versus inaction, honestly. And I think the government can prevent you from taking an aggressive action that would harm somebody. I don't think they can compel you to do something that would save somebody. And that gets back to, stuff like COVID restrictions and masks. I don't think the government should compel you to wear a mask. Wearing a mask, maybe if we got data that said, oh, yes, wearing a mask does save lives, which we don't have that data. The data doesn't exist. Nobody can show me the actual data that says that wearing masks saves lives. They can show me a mathematical model that was created based on assumptions that masks save lives, but they can't actually like prove it. But let's say they could prove it. I would still say the government shouldn't force you to wear a mask. The government could recommend it and say, hey, this is a good thing. It's a noble thing. It's a beneficial thing. But they can't mandate it. But they can prevent you from, let's say you have COVID and you have symptoms and you're coughing and you're sneezing and you decide to walk into a nursing home and go cough all over an elderly patient. That could be, the government could say, you know what, that was an aggressive act that you took knowingly intending to cause harm. Maybe we stop you from doing that, right? That could be a situation that I could understand. But the idea of we don't want to compel somebody to take action to save someone. We want to prevent them from harming another person. And so that would be and one of the things that Boonin points out in his argument is he tries to make a distinction between disconnecting and dismembering. Like the idea that, okay, in an abortion, well, Trent Horn actually makes the point that in an abortion, he plays one of Dr. Anthony Levatino's videos that talks about how second trimester abortions are performed, or even I think it was first trimester, the vacuum aspiration abortions, and he plays the video, and it's very disturbing. Like Dr. Levatino doesn't use graphic language or graphic images, but it's still very disturbing, just him describing it very clinically. And so he makes that point of like, hey, this is not just refusing to help somebody. And Boonin says, well, okay, but what if we, maybe there are some abortions that would be illegal then because they're actively harming, either actively ending the life, actively dismembering. But then there are other abortions that are not. And I would disagree with that. I would say there is no abortion procedure that simply disconnects the baby from the mother. Because that goes back to the violinist argument. If you're not familiar with that, just Google violinist abortion and it'll come up. You'll hear different people talking about it. But the violinist argument is basically, can you disconnect from somebody who will die if you disconnect? But that assumes that abortion is disconnecting, and it is not. There is no abortion method that simply disconnects. Now, someday we may reach the point where we have artificial wombs or the ability to transfer a child from one womb to another. If we come up with either of those things, we may reach a point where you at 12 weeks could say, or 8 weeks or whatever weeks, could say, you know what, I don't want to be pregnant, disconnect the baby, place the baby somewhere safe, I'm done. And that would be fine by me. I would be totally fine with that. Now, I think if we to that point, there are other ethical considerations with those technologies that we have to consider. But as far as being able to disconnect the baby and place them somewhere safe, I think that would be just fine. But we're not there yet. So there is no way to simply disconnect. It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Every abortion method, including the medication abortion, is violent, is aggressive by nature. It is inherently aggressive, inherently violent. And so you cannot compare it to simply pulling a plug or disconnecting. So yeah, if you have questions about any of that I just said, feel free to put those in the chat. I love to read the chat. But otherwise, I do want to go into some other interesting things. This is where I switch gears into GameStop and other things that could happen this week, this year, this month, whatever. So let's kind of switch into that. And again, at the end of the live stream, I will go and put a timestamp in the description so that you know if you want to skip to one part or the other. So anyway, GameStop this week. So if you've been following on Tumblr, I've been posting some updates every so often as I learn new information. So GameStop, if you're not familiar, I mean, you should be probably somewhat familiar at this point. But if you're paying attention to the media, mainstream media, what you're hearing about GameStop is that it was, there was a squeeze in January, bunch of people made money, some people lost money, and it's over. There's actually already a Hulu documentary, or HBO, I think it's HBO, documentary about GameStop. And I'm like, it's not over. How can you make a documentary about something that is actively ongoing? So the idea here is that in January, there was the beginnings of what could have been a short squeeze. However, Robinhood, at the insistence of the DTCC and Citadel and all of them, stopped people from buying. When you have stocks, when stocks go up and down, stocks go up when people buy and they go down when people sell. If people cannot buy, the price will go down. That's how it works. So by stopping people from buying, they manipulated the price. It was stock price manipulation, pure and simple, and they still have not appropriately answered for that. The DTCC was partially responsible for this, and they have not answered for that. However, here's what's really interesting. In that moment, there was an opportunity for Melvin, Citadel, and all those hedge funds and all those different financial institutions to start getting out of GameStop and say, this is too risky. This is too big. We got to start covering our positions. They didn't. So here's the thing. Some of the data that goes around where it's like, oh, look, they covered. That is self-reported data. That is self-reported data. There is no accountability for that data. They would have to get like a full audit, and that's not going to happen. From the data that we've seen, and other people who understand this better than I do on Reddit have been digging all this up and laying it out and saying and linking things, and here's that. So if you really, really want to go in deep on this, Reddit, so Wall Street Bets, which is the original forum, original subreddit where all this was happening, there are still people who are doing this stuff on there. However, most of it is now either on Wall Street Bets New or r/GME, because essentially, because Wall Street Bets got so much attention from the media and from the financial institutions, essentially you have bots and spam and all this stuff that's essentially trying to undermine those who are legitimately trying to talk about stocks. You also have some people on Wall Street Bets who weren't really all in on GameStop, and they want to go back to talking about other stocks, and they're kind of like done with it. So a lot of people who are serious about GameStop and understand what's really going on with it have moved to either r/GME or r/Wall Street Bets new. So those are kind of the two places that I look at. Mostly I look at r/GME because it really is GameStop focused, and they're really go in detail. But so you have people who understand this way better than I do and who have access to more data because they're like stock traders. Like they've been doing day trading, they've been doing stock trading longer. And so they've paid for subscriptions to different services that allow them access to data that you and I can't just look up on our own. And so they have data that they're able to share. And basically, it appears that what happened was not only did these financial institutions and hedge funds not cover their positions, they dug themselves in deeper. And some of the financial institutions, respond like they said, "Oh, you've got these shorts. You're expecting to go down. What if I'm going to bet against you? I'm going to say it's going to go up." Actually, they're still saying it's going to go down because call options, right? So call options are if I buy a call option, what I'm saying is I think it's going to go up. I think it's going to go above this price. So I buy a call option at this price where I say before the option expires, at some point during there, I have the right to buy 100 shares at this price. So I think it's going to go above that price. And then it goes above that price, and then I can buy those shares at the price that I specified, and I can immediately sell them and make a profit. However, if you write a call option, so I have to buy that call option from somebody, right? If I buy a call option at, let's say, 800, I think it's going to go above 800 a share. I'm buying that from a market maker such as Citadel. And so Citadel did this. Citadel wrote call options. So Citadel is betting that it's going to go down. So they're writing the call option and selling it to me because they're hoping that if it doesn't go above 800, I won't exercise it, and they'll take whatever money that I paid to buy the option, and they won't actually have to give me the shares. Now, with that call option, where I have the right to buy, 100 shares at $800 a share, if I exercise that option, Citadel has to give me those shares, which means Citadel has to have those shares. Between the shorts and the calls and all of these different things, there is no mathematically possible way for Citadel and Melvin and these other hedge funds to actually cover everything that they owe, everything that they borrowed or that they promised. So in the case of the call options, they haven't even borrowed the shares, they've simply promised the shares. They promised that they can give those shares. There is no mathematically possible way that they have enough shares to cover, because according to the data that we have, they owe anywhere from 400 to 500% of the total shares of GameStop. That means they owe they are supposed to deliver under these contracts, whether right now or sometime in the future, 4 or 5 times as many shares as exist. That means they owe shares that do not exist. And with some other stuff, there's basically this whole thing where they're like financial institutions claim to own, like this one says, oh, we have this many shares and we have this many shares and we have this many shares. And they're all saying how many shares they have. And if you add all those numbers together, it's greater than the total number of shares. So there are somehow synthetic counterfeit shares out there somehow through all this nonsense. And so, but basically, if all this comes due, and really this comes down to where GameStop closes price wise on a given day, which contracts are in or out of the money, and it gets complicated. But basically, if it stays above 200 and if it continues to go up, which we think it will, like those of us who are kind of invested in this think it will, these institutions are going to have to deliver these shares. Now, normally, and this is what happened in January. In January, they had this deadline, they were supposed to deliver the shares, and they just didn't. They just didn't deliver because they get this like grace period. They get this like 26 days or something like that where they can say, "Oh, we're working on it. We're working on it." And they don't actually, get held accountable. The DTCC, which is basically the clearinghouse through which pretty much all trades in the American markets go. So you think about NASDAQ, NYSE, whatever, everything goes through DTCC. They're the regulators, essentially. They're like a non-government regulator kind of thing. They're now saying you no longer have 26 days to fulfill these obligations. You have to Citadel, to Melvin, to whoever, you have to start filling them day by day. And that rule begins this coming week. So they're going to start being forced to buy shares. Now, here's the question. Do they comply? Do they cooperate? Or do they somehow find some loophole and resist? We'll see. But they're going to be forced to start buying shares to deliver to those who they owe shares to. And because some of these calls and things and shorts and whatever were in or out of the money. I get confused on this part. But they were because it closed at 200 on Friday, they have to deliver a whole bunch of these shares on Monday. And then on the 23rd, which I'm just going to I should have checked this real quick. On the 23rd, which is Tuesday. So on Tuesday is GameStop's earnings call. And so GameStop is going to have that's when they report their earnings for a fourth quarter. And we're expecting, just from chatter and from kind of cryptic tweets from Ryan Cohen, who's on the board now, we're expecting big announcements at that earnings call, which could boost the price. So we're expecting it to go up we're expecting the price to go crazy on Monday, whether it goes up or down or sideways. It's gonna be volatile on Monday. We're expecting it to go up potential. Well, Tuesday, the earnings call is not till the afternoon after markets close. So it may go up on Tuesday, but it may be Wednesday where we actually see some growth. But then once it kicks off, once it hits a certain point, that's where we get the quote unquote rocket, where essentially it's a snowball effect because it hits this price. And because it hits this price, all these options come into effect. So these guys have to buy, and then it goes boop, 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 and it starts building up. And the price goes up, and the higher the price goes, the more contracts need to be fulfilled and all of that. So there are people talking about prices going as high. I mean, before we talked about, the price could go up to 1,000. Oh my gosh, that would be so crazy. There's people talking about 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. There's people I think there's jokes about 1 million. Maybe it could actually go that. I don't think it'll go that high. But here's my concern. As much as it would be cool to make a whole bunch of money off of GameStop, and if you even have just a couple of shares and it goes up to 100,000, you just made $200,000. Oh my gosh, you just have to imagine just $200,000 out of nowhere, right? Yeah, so that's cool and all, but here's the thing: Citadel and Melvin and all of them can't pay any of that. They can't pay that price for how many shares they owe. There's estimates that they may owe, as in they need to deliver, all these financial institutions that are in on this, they may need to deliver as many as 350 million shares. No, yeah, 350 million shares. That's correct. If that is the case, if the price gets up to 180,000, I can see Christina Metti. Christina, I'm not gonna try to pronounce your last name. Sorry, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how complicated all this is. But you explain it in such a clear way; it's really helpful. Okay, I'm glad I'm being helpful. Sometimes I feel like I'm just confusing people more. No, but so if it gets up to if the share price got up to 180,000, the total liability for assuming it's approximately 350 million shares, we don't know for sure because the data is not transparent enough. But assuming it's 350 million shares at 180,000 a share, that's $63 trillion. That happens to be the amount of assets that the DTCC manages. Now remember, Melvin cannot pay this. Citadel cannot pay this. If Citadel goes bankrupt and has outstanding liabilities, those liabilities go to the DTCC. The DTCC has members that include Citadel, and every other major bank and financial institution you've ever heard of. Chase Bank, Bank of America, every major bank is part of the DTCC. And the DTCC has in their agreements, in their membership agreement, basically, if one member defaults and DTCC has to cover their liability, they can go and turn to a non defaulting member, a member who has not defaulted on their liabilities, and say, you have to liquidate to cover this. Now, like I said, the DTCC manages $63 trillion in assets from all of these different banks, from all of these different institutions. If the share price of GameStop goes up to 180,000, the DTCC will have to liquidate all $63 trillion in order to cover. So I don't think that's going to happen because I think the government will step in before that point. But there's different ways the government can step in. If the government steps in by printing money to bail out banks or bail out the DTCC, we're going to see massive hyperinflation. That's a massive amount of money. And the thing is, but here's the thing, where does that money go? So the money goes to DTCC. DTCC has to buy shares of GameStop from who? Who's selling shares of GameStop? Institutions, yes. There will be financial institutions who have GameStop who will be selling it. There will also be people like you and me who own GameStop who will be selling at those prices. Now, you have to decide if you own GameStop right now. You have to decide when you're willing to sell. I know people who are willing to hold until the whole thing is over and they don't care if they miss out on millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars or more. They don't care because they just want to screw over the hedge funds. And if that's you, go for it. You don't have to worry about this. But if you are hoping to make money, or at least hoping to recoup your losses, you do have to think about the balance between the maxing out your gains, maxing out your tendies, and not missing the peak. However, here's the thing. This is my husband pointed this out to me. Let's say you sell at 50,000. Say you sell at 50,000 a share. And then the price continues to go up. And you're like, oh man, I missed out on some gains, but whatever. I got my money. I got a good amount of money just from that 50,000, from selling at 50,000 a share. If it gets up to 180,000 or even close to that, and the government steps in and bails out, the hyperinflation could make your 50,000 worthless. So this is what you have to think about. Whatever point you pick, where you say at this point I'm going to sell, whether you're like I'm going to ride it all the way to the top and I'm going to get all my tendies, or I'm going to wait till I'm going to get it to a certain level and then I'm going to whatever. You have to think about where does that money go when you sell, because you sell that. Let's say you sell at 100,000 a share. Now you have all this money in your bank account or in your platform or whatever, and you're withdrawing that money. You're putting it in your bank account, and now you're like, man, I'm ready. Like I got all this money. What do you do with that money? How do you protect that money against inflation? So that is something for you to research on, yourself. And there's all kinds of different discussions on how to protect money from inflation. Typically speaking, index funds do protect against inflation because they follow the whole market. So if the whole market goes up, so does the index fund, so does your money, typically. Other things like physical, tangible assets can protect against inflation. Some are speculating that Bitcoin could be a good hedge against inflation because it cannot be printed. You can't print Bitcoin. There's a finite amount of Bitcoin, and it is actually reducing the number of Bitcoin available because some people have like totally lost their Bitcoin that they bought way back in the day, and that can't be recovered. So in a sense, Bitcoin is actually almost deflationary in that sense, and so it can be a good hedge against inflation. Real estate can be, if you end up making crazy money because you have a whole bunch of GameStop shares that you bought at $40 and they go up to 100,000 a piece, and you have crazy money that you can spend. Real estate could be a great way to hedge against inflation. You have to think about property tax. You have to think about all those things. But so if you're in GameStop You need to be thinking about your exit strategy, not just at what point do you sell, but what do you do with that money in case we hit hyperinflation. Other possible things that could happen if the government did not intervene, which is very unlikely. Government usually intervenes. If the government does not intervene and just lets this go, it could go crazy high. And then we could either see inflation simply, well, what would happen eventually is the DTCC and all these banks would collapse and we would see a financial crisis. However, if you held and you had your GameStop, you might be okay. But then you'd have to think about, okay, I made my money, but now our financial systems are in ruins. How do I turn around and then help my communities rebuild? Right? How do I make sure that my communities are strong and survive and make it through this? If people lose their jobs, if there's any kind of crisis within my community. So thinking about those things, thinking about charity, thinking about how am I going to give back if I do make crazy money on this. And then another possibility is that the US government somehow intervenes to relieve the DTCC or other institutions of their liabilities, which the problem there is if they do that, then international investors say, I no longer want to participate in the American market because I cannot be guaranteed that my contracts will be honored. If I make a contract, it may not be enforced. So that would be the other side of that, and then that would essentially cause us to no longer be the kind of the default, the reserve currency, the reserve financial system, and then we could see financial collapse or hyperinflation that way. So regardless of the scenario, regardless of how this plays out, and even if nothing happened with GameStop, even if it wasn't a thing, I do think even then we're already on a path to hyperinflation. We're already on very fragile footing with our financial systems. So I do think that regardless of what happens with GameStop, whether it goes to the moon or not, you do need to be thinking about what do you do if our financial system collapses. I also have concerns about our power grid and our supply chain. They are very fragile systems, as we found out in Texas a month ago. We found out how fragile our power systems really are. And it's not like Texas is more fragile than other. No, we just happened to get hit in a particular way that made it go down. Same thing could happen to the East Coast or West Coast grids, right? And everybody in America is either on the Texas grid, the East grid, or the West grid. You're on one of those three grids. And if one of those goes down, we have problems. I do believe that we could see cybersecurity attacks on our grids. China has definitely positioned themselves such that we know that they have essentially backdoors into different pieces of equipment on our grid. Trump's administration found that and said that's not good and said no more parts from China in our electrical grid. And then when Biden came into office, one of his first actions was to put a 60-day pause on that policy to evaluate whether it's necessary. So we know that at this point, or we can reasonably assume that we do at this point have equipment in our electrical grid that has essentially a backdoor that could be exploited by China or any other foreign power that wants to take us down. And there are many of them that want to take us down. So there are concerns there that we could have a foreign attack. There's also concerns that we have people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and the World Economic Forum that have talked about, how great the lockdowns were for our environment and how, look at our reduced emissions and we need to reduce emissions and look, the lockdowns reduced our emissions. So I think there is going to be a push either for another round of lockdowns, whether they are COVID lockdowns or climate lockdowns or something like that. There's going to be some kind of push there. And potentially some kind of problem with our grid, whether it is for an adversary attack or whether it is orchestrated by those who would like to see us reduced, in population and emissions and whatever. So I do have those concerns. Specifically, my concerns right now are with our oil and gas supply chain. We have elites. We have, World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, all these people who are like, we need to reduce our dependence on oil and gas and we need to reduce our emissions, blah, blah, blah. They're saying all this stuff. Meanwhile, they have heavy, heavy involvement and interest in oil and gas industry. Like they have controlling interest in those areas. Jeff Bezos, over the last several years, has been convincing oil and gas companies to use Amazon Web Services for all of their digital infrastructure. So, if you're not familiar, Amazon Web Services is basically most of the internet. Their servers host most websites. That's why they were able to take down Parler. Um, and Bezos essentially convinced them you need to put all your stuff on the cloud, all of your infrastructure on the cloud, and put it on Amazon. So then Bezos recently stepped down from Amazon. So you think, oh well, he's not involved anymore. Well, he's still involved, and he put whatever in place that he needed to put in place. Bill Gates recently bought, or a few months ago, bought controlling percentage share of a Canadian railway that transports various things, both throughout Canada and also down the Mississippi. So basically a central part of our supply chain in the United States. And I'm thinking supply chain like food and medicine and things like that. What I wasn't thinking about is oil. So a lot of oil is transported by either truck or by train or by pipeline. So we were going to have a Dakota Access pipeline that was going to transport oil from Canada through the United States. Then that got shut down. So I think about it. Okay, so Biden shuts down the Dakota Access pipeline, which means more oil is going to continue to be routed primarily through trains and freight, trucks and stuff like that. But a lot of it through, say, the Canadian railway that Bill Gates now has controlling interest over. We know that, so basically between Bezos and Bill Gates, they could essentially say, you know what, we're going to shut down, and they could do it openly. They could say, yes, we're going to do this because we need to save the environment, or it could be a cybersecurity attack. Now, here's the thing. Back in October of 2019, the World Economic Forum and Bill Gates and all of these other people held Event 201. And if you Google Event 201, there is a website, there is video. They are not hiding this. They didn't hide this. It's not a secret conspiracy thing. They announced it. They put up video. They put up, media, like photos and things. They're like, look at our, Event 201. And Event 201 was a pandemic planning scenario. It was a tabletop role-playing scenario. Think Dungeons and Dragons, but with a bunch of rich and powerful people role-playing how they would handle a pandemic, a viral pandemic with a respiratory virus, and how they would use media and government to get people to comply with public health orders. Sound familiar? This was October of 2019. Now, here's the thing. In October of 2019, China knew that they had a virus, and because we know that now. We know now that they hid it from us, that they had the information back in October. They didn't tell us until late December, early January what was going on, and even then they hid most of the information. We know this also because we know that the virus was in places like California back in November, because we have people who have antibodies from it who donated blood back in like November, and they test that blood and it's got the antibodies. So we know that China knew about the virus as early as October. China is a big participant in these events, in Event 201 and the World Economic Forum. They are a big part of this. In fact, World Economic Forum just had one of their big speaking conference events, and President Xi of China was their keynote speaker. So if China knows that they have this virus, whether they released it on purpose or not, doesn't matter. They know that they have this virus, and they go to this pandemic planning scenario and say, hey guys, here's what we're going to plan for. Here's our scenario that we're going to plan around. Okay. So to me, I look at that and I say, okay, what else are they planning for? What else is the World Economic Forum? What else is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation concerned about? What are they getting ready for? This summer, they will be hosting a cybersecurity forum where they will be talking about they will be doing a scenario, a role-playing planning scenario for a cybersecurity attack on our supply chain. Now, when I first heard that, I thought food supply, right? That's what when I say supply chain, I think food supply. I now think it may be oil and gas. What if, we know China has backdoors in our grid because they put them there. Trump administration found them, tried to ban it. Biden reversed it. So we know that there are backdoors in our electrical grid that China knows how to exploit, that China put there. We know that China is involved in the World Economic Forum and all of these high level elite events, kind of globalist things. And we know that they're planning for a cybersecurity attack. We know that Amazon Web Services is the primary digital infrastructure for our oil and gas industry. What if there was all of a sudden a cybersecurity attack, a coordinated attack, two-pronged on our electrical grid and on our Amazon Web Services, on our internet, basically? You do that, you take down the country, especially if they can get both, if they can get all three grids, if they get East Coast, East, West, and Texas, all three. And now there have been huge pushes to connect Texas to the national grid because the East and West are actually connected to each other. Texas is still technically disconnected. There's some connections or whatever, but they want to connect Texas to the rest of the national grid. If they manage to do that, this is much easier, but they could probably still do it regardless. You take down the grid and you take down Amazon Web Services, and essentially you leave everybody in the dark and you shut down the supply chain. Nobody has access to food. Nobody has access to clean water. Nobody has access to fuel for transportation or anything. You shut down the country. So let's say it's a cybersecurity attack. Oh no, one of our enemies did this to us. Oh no, why weren't we prepared? Blah 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 blah. And then you have hundreds of millions of people who are not prepared to take care of themselves, who are not prepared to go even a week without access to a grocery store, without power, without clean water, running water. And so you have a huge population of desperate, hungry, scared people. Who's going to come to the rescue? Maybe our US military, but what if they're also crippled by this? What if they're not prepared for this, or they don't have the resources to get to everybody everywhere? You have so many of our troops overseas. You have all of that all these resources overseas. Something happens here. What if they have a hard time getting to us? Who shows up on our beaches? Who shows up on our coast, on our west coast? The UN. All in all their blue helmets. China at the forefront of the relief effort. China comes in as our savior. They're coming to help us. They see that we're in need. They're going to help us. And then they establish control posts. They establish little, offices. This is for logistics and distribution. And we're also going to provide security because, rule of law is broken down by this point. So we're going to come in, establish security, establish law and order. You want law and order, right? And hey, here's your ration card. So you can come get supplies, get things you need. Oh, you're breaking the rules. You're not following the rules. You're not following the laws. We might have to take away your ration card. We might have to limit your rations for this month. Right? You see how easily they can come in, they don't have to invade us with tanks and guns. They could take down our grid and come in, swoop in, and be the quote unquote be the hero and essentially take over. Now, I don't know that this is going to happen for sure. I cannot predict the future, but this is what I could see as a possibility based on the moves that I'm seeing. China, Bill Gates, World Economic Forum, all these people who have this globalist agenda of population reduction, of reducing emissions, whatever, of control and globalism and all of this stuff. Based on what I'm seeing, this is the scenario I could see playing out. So what do you do? How do you prepare for this? Because this is scary. And I tell people my theories on this, and they're scared. It is scary, but you're not helpless. The only way that their plan works is if you and I are helpless and vulnerable and weak. We don't have to be. There are a lot of things we can do. Number one is storing at least a month. I used to say 2 weeks because 2 weeks is the recommendation for like a hurricane or a tornado or something comes into your area. I'm recommending a month of food and water. Now, for water, if you have access to water and a way to clean and purify and filter it, that's fine. As long as you have access and you have reliable access. Like let's say you live near a river and you can go collect water, clean and purify it, then that's fine. But food and water to last you a month, and preferably an idea of how you could go supply more food and water when that runs out. Whether it is you live in an area where there's lots of wildlife that you can hunt and trap, and you know how to hunt and trap. If you don't, you need to learn. Or you have a garden where you're growing some of your own food. Maybe you can scale that up in an emergency. But thinking about those things, being able to forage for food, knowing what wild edible plants grow in your area, how can you forage for food? You need to be thinking about those things. Another thing, generally speaking, is reducing your dependence on our supply chain. Buying local. Buy from your farmer's market. When you buy groceries, go to your farmer's market. Buy from a local grocery store. Buy things that are in season and that are locally grown. Support your local infrastructure because that will be what saves people in a disaster. So the more that you can be less dependent on a global supply chain, the more protected you and your family will be if this does happen or if any other craziness happens. I'm watching the COVID stuff and I see other countries going into new lockdowns. France like locking down and all this stuff, going into COVID lockdowns. I see uh, I see people talking about getting all scared about variants and things, and I see articles criticizing college students in Florida on spring break and where, like, oh, they don't know that there's a pandemic going on, blah, blah, blah. This sounds so familiar. It sounds like exactly where we were right before they shut us down the first time. So I would not be surprised. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I would not be surprised if Biden did try to do some kind of federal lockdown or some kind of thing where he incentivizes governors to lock down or whatever. It's, history does not repeat itself, but history does rhyme. Somebody said that. I didn't make that up, but I think it's true. History rhymes. We see the same patterns over and over and over again, and we have to start learning from them. We've experienced empty shelves in the grocery store. We've all experienced that. We've experienced rioting in the streets because now we have George Floyd, the Derek Chauvin, the police officer from the George Floyd case, is on trial. And no matter what happens with that trial, I think there will be riots. If he gets acquitted, there will be lots of riots. If there's a mistrial or something gets changed with the trial date or anything like that, I think there will be riots. So I think we're going to see riots again, just like we did. It rhymes. We need to see the patterns and we need to prepare. You need to be prepared to feed your family if there's nothing on the shelves in the store. You need to be prepared to defend your family if rioters show up in your neighborhood. And you need to be prepared to keep your family warm and safe and protected if our grid goes down. And we are past the time of this being kind of like, oh, maybe someday some crazy thing will happen and it's better to be prepared. I really think that this coming year, that 2021 is going to be a whole different level. And as far as the grid down, supply chain cybersecurity attack, if I had to make a prediction of when that would happen, I can't guarantee anything. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope none of this happens. I hope I'm totally wrong. But if I had to make a prediction, I would say this coming winter, because if you're going to take down the grid, the absolute worst time to do that is winter. When less food is being grown, and most places can't grow any food at all. When it's cold and there's demand for heat, because in the summer, it's hot and people need air conditioning, but people can't. There's other ways to stay cool. In the winter, if you cut off people's heat and they don't have other ways to stay warm, that's can be much more deadly, much more quickly. So if you were trying to cause chaos and make people desperate and needy, winter would be the time to do that. So I would say if you're trying to prepare and you're trying to store up food, I would say sooner the better. Start now. But I would say if you're like, hey, I'm going to start a garden, I'm going to buy land and whatever, I would say winter is when I would expect things to get crazy, and I would want people to be prepared before that point. So my goal is to be more prepared. There's different things I have in the works, even the possibility of potentially not being in a tiny little apartment. I'm trying to get out of this apartment very soon, hopefully. We'll see what happens. Depends on what happens with GameStop, depends on what happens with other things, but maybe able to get out of this tiny little apartment, be able to grow more food, be able to store away more food. That's the goal. Be able to do things like solar panels and stuff like that, and rainwater collection, to kind of as hedges against grid failure. So I'm looking into all those things for myself. Another big thing that I'm trying to do, eating healthier. I can. It's hard. It's so easy to eat fast food and junk food. It's way too easy. I'm trying to eat healthier. I'm also trying to exercise more, because I realize that if we do face a disaster like this, I'm going to have to do a lot more manual labor. We're all going to have to do a lot more manual labor than we're used to. And I want to be in better shape. So it's my goal is to get in better shape, to store up that food, to store up those supplies, and be ready by this winter. And I hope that's your goal too. Again, 1 month of food and either a month of supply of water or a reliable way to collect and purify water for yourself. And that's a month of food for your whole family. For water, for food, they recommend whatever 2,000 calories a day. That varies depending on your needs, and children obviously don't necessarily need as much, and that sort of thing. For water, they recommend a gallon per person per day, and that's just for drinking and cooking. That's not for showers. That's not for other stuff like that. So thinking about that, um, just just be thinking about these things, and the thing is, the more prepared we all are, even if everybody just has a month of food and a way to get water, just those two things drastically reduce the burden on the system as we try to rebuild after some kind of crazy disaster. So that would be my recommendation, is at least the month of food and water, if nothing else. If everybody did that, they would be so much harder for countries like China to take us down. But as it is, we are weak, we are dependent, we are vulnerable, and we need to fix that. So I hope that was helpful to everybody. If there's questions, I'd love to see those in the chat. Otherwise, um, thank you guys for tuning in. I know this went a little bit long. I try to keep it about an hour. Went a little bit over. I think that's all right. I'll put those timestamps in the description. So if you're coming back to this and you just want to watch one part of it, I'll do that real quick. And then yeah. So y'all have a great week. Let's see. Next Saturday I should still be able to be live. Yeah, I think we're okay. In May, there might be a couple of Saturdays coming up where I can't be live. I'll try to make videos for those days, so there's still something for y'all to watch. But I should be live next week. And let me know in the comments if you have specific topics you want me to talk more about. Either something I've been talking about or something new that you want me to focus on. Questions that you have, please put those in the comments after the stream's over, and I'll keep an eye on those, and try and incorporate those into my next video. So y'all, thank you very much, and I will see y'all next week.